Yes, it's time for The World This Week. 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. With us, Christopher Dickey of Newsweek and The Daily Beast. How are you, sir?
Fine.
Fresh off the plane from?
Fresh from New York.
From New York City, okay. Vivian Walt is back with us. How are you?
Very good.
Vivian Walt of Time Magazine. Ulrike Koltermann, Paris-based journalist, former DPA correspondent, currently working on a new book.
On French nuclear power.
On French nuclear power.
Big developments.
Yeah. Topical this Friday. And Craig Kapidis of Quartz, the Atlantic's, say it for me, Craig.
Quartz, the Atlantic Group. The Atlantic Group's soon-to-be-released business and finance publication.
All right. And The World This Week throughout the week, where you can always join the conversation or weigh in on the topics on our Facebook page, and on Twitter you can find us at FrancoisF24. Now, no one we know had ever heard of this obscure anti-Islam video making the rounds on YouTube, not until the 11th anniversary of September the 11th. Tuesday's violence included the storming of the U.S. Embassy in Cairo and the killing of the U.S. ambassador to Libya. By Friday, the protests had gone worldwide. Protests everywhere there, as you can see, from Tunisia to Indonesia. But it's not one size fits all, is it, Christopher?
No, it really isn't. It's a question of taking this issue of the film that's offensive to Muslims and having many groups use it for their own political designs. In Egypt, for instance, you've got the Salafis leading most of this protest. And they're trying to one-up the Muslim Brotherhood. The Salafis are not controlling the government. The Muslim Brotherhood is. They want to show that they're better protectors of the faith than the Muslim Brotherhood. And you have the same kinds of local issues playing out almost everywhere. It's why some of the incidents don't make any sense at all. Why was the German embassy attacked in Sudan?
Because it's close to the British, probably.
Just because it's easy.
It's easy.
I mean,
voilà.
And because people are trying to score different kinds of points. There is anger about an anti-Muslim film, but it's being used as a pretext for local politics. All politics is local.
Interesting. Vivian Walt, in the cover story in Time Magazine, The Agents of Outrage, Bobby Ghosh writes how the Muslim haters in the U.S. and the hardliners in the Muslim world seem to be feeding off one another in this story.
Well, yes. I mean, of course, that's not new, but you have it coming at a very particular point in time. And in a sense, it's feeding on itself rather than feeding off each other. Very much like Chris says, you have several countries where they've stripped away decades of dictatorships that essentially put a lid on a lot of Islamic militancy, a lot of, outward expressions of Islamic fervor. All that's gone. And in its place is a kind of scramble for, if you like, the soul of the country, whether it be Egypt or Tunisia or Libya or several other places actually in play right now. And in that sense, of course, you have the perfect foil, if you like, coming out of the U.S.
In the particular case of Tunisia, it's interesting. People here in France are watching this with jaws dropped this Friday.
Well, people always have a somewhat, I think, distorted view of Tunisia. Yes, it was where the Arab Spring began, and it is, of course, 2 hours from Paris by plane. We think of it being, right in our backyard. But that's Tunis, and Tunis is not Tunisia. And there is really quite a strong conservative Islamic feeling that goes through Tunisia, and we've seen it play out quite strongly in the last 3 months. You have a lot of cases against blasphemy. You have alcohol stores being attacked. You have art galleries being smashed, and this was not exactly a bolt out of the blue.
Not a bolt out of the blue, Ulrike Koltermann?
No, we had exactly the same incident when we had the Mohammed cartoons in the Danish newspaper. It was similar because they were published and for weeks nothing happened, even for months. And then all of a sudden violence broke out all over the world, more or less, and there were more than 100 people killed. And I think it's very similar because there is a pretext, and everyone finds something that violence can break out. So they use it, and but in every single place where the violence is, there might be a different reason behind it.
A different reason behind it, but the butt of that of the protest is the United States, Craig Peters.
Well, absolutely. The Obama administration appears to have fumbled this. It's being portrayed as a reflection of failure by many people. The phrase I keep hearing from the United States from certain quarters is, Obama is an appeaser, like Neville Chamberlain was.
Apology is the word.
Apology.
The Romney wants to
apology
use.
tour, but you hear this word appeasement, and I think it's an important word because the cold, harsh reality is that America has to intercede, has to play a global role, whether one likes it or not. I don't see Obama. I see him as an apologist, but not an appeaser. The problem I think they have, though, is if you look at Morrissey, he has to appease the people who put him in power. And if you look at all these various groups, as Chris was pointing out, and they are various and they have different agendas, they're mostly uneducated, they're mostly very poor, and for decades under Mubarak appeased them by beating them and jailing them. It's what I don't understand here is how these so-called New Age Arab regimes are going to be able to appease their people, to make them understand that there's a pluralism in the world. If they want to believe in Allah and you cannot defame his name, fine. But in the United States, you can. That's part of democracy. That's that's what, as I see it here, there's a real big learning curve going on in the Middle East right now.
All right, Christopher, let me just remind people of a tweet that you put out earlier in the day. You said,
oh my God, what did I say?
You said on National Public Radio, I raised a question I can't answer. When the world is a crowded theater, do we have the right to shout fire?
Well, this is a question. The real question in this case, I mean, there are two things going on. One is, when you have a world that's as closely tied together as this world is now by the internet and by satellite television, what you say in an obscure theater in California can cause an eruption in Egypt. Now, is that going to lead to constraints on freedom of expression, where we all have to second guess what the thinking, political and religious fervor is doing in, say, Indonesia? I hope not. But on the other hand, you can be responsible and say, am I doing this precisely to provoke a panic, precisely to provoke a riot? In this case, it is pretty clear that was the intent. Now, all of a sudden, people are acting as if this is a huge global phenomenon because we see this video, satellite video, of all these riots going on around the world. But a lot of those riots only include a few hundred people. And all of a sudden, you see raised again the issue of the clash of civilizations. This is not a clash of civilizations. This is a clash of cynicism. Cynical people trying to provoke Muslims and cynical people manipulating their anger for their own political purposes.
In the United States, Ulrika, the freedom of speech is enshrined in the Constitution. In France, there are laws against making racist comments or hateful comments. Which one's better when you look at this situation?
It's really tricky. And the problem is also the United States now, they're much more vulnerable because of their election campaign. So this is a perfect pretext now to make campaign with, to say, okay, is this a moment to leave the Arab world? Do they prove that it's not worth investing in democracy? And so it becomes a very political issue in the US. So, and there's also a theory that it was a long-planned attack, and it happened exactly on the 11th of September. So it was not only related to the film, but the movie might have been just a further input. And the problem is that the United States are just too vulnerable right now.
When we discussed this story on the set on Wednesday, the Libyans that we spoke to expressed outrage and shame at the killing of the ambassador. Some even took to the streets of Benghazi to condemn the violence. Others openly defending Christopher Stevens, who over the summer spoke to Libya's Al Hurra television.
بصفة عامة الليبيين يرحبون بوجود الأجانب في ليبيا، هذا من وجهة نظري ومن وجهة نظر زملائي كذلك. وأنا اكتشفت أن الليبيين هم أشخاص مضيفون وقلبهم صاف، وأنا أشعر بطمأنينة تجاه البيئة التي أتواجد فيها. صحيح أن هناك هجمات كانت أمر مؤسف للغاية، ولكن أنا متأكد أن السلطات الليبية تقوم بالتحقيق في هذه الهجمات.
And Vivian Walter, you published a story this week about Christopher Stevens.
He was one of those rare diplomats, I think fairly rare, in that he was truly passionate about this region. Unfortunately, it appears from all accounts that Libya has lost really quite an amazingly good ally. I only met him once, actually, in Benghazi. But he had gone into Benghazi in the early days of the revolution and was almost alone there in opening up a U.S. presence and had formed some very close links. I mean, the big question in Benghazi is, how did this happen? Clearly, there was a massive failure of both security but also human intelligence. They should have known that this was going to happen. There are all signs of it having been a planned attack.
What you say, all signs, but people with RPGs outside the U.S. consulate there, is it because it's well planned, or is it just because, well, Libya is a place where everyone's armed to the teeth after a civil war?
Well, that is true. It doesn't explain the lack of security. There ought to have been considerable security. You had the U.S. ambassador staying overnight in a place on September 11th, where in a city where they had, set off an explosive device outside those offices just a couple of months ago. Yeah. So, there had been a kind of warning shot.
This is an illustration of this reflection of failure going on, and what's doubly tragic is this diplomat represented a type that America, albeit the entire West, needed to do this kind of yeoman work on the ground. He was an individual who could have bridged the gaps that we see there over the long term. He was definitely committed. He used to work for the Peace Corps in the Maghreb. So he had a long background, and I believe that, that his death has put back the time frame for getting the Arab world and the United States closer together.
U.S. diplomats will all now be just like in Baghdad, behind a bunker.
Well, they've been that way. They've been that way for a long time. And I think one of the things that Stevens was trying to do was get out of the bunker, get out and talk to the people and be with the people.
Yes, precisely.
I don't think there's much question anymore that that was a planned attack. But it took place in a context in which there was an unplanned protest going on outside the embassy. The attack itself, the deadliest part of that attack, actually took place at the safe house, where people had fled when the embassy came under assault. And that takes some considerable intelligence to know where the safe house was, how they were going there, and to then attack it and ambush the people who came to do the rescue
with mortars.
mission.
It was a coordinated mortar attack.
No, I think there's no question. But if you look at who the people were who were involved, I mean, for instance, one of the Americans who was killed was a former Navy SEAL who was on contract trying to recover MANPAD, shoulder-launched anti-aircraft missiles, from various parties, including, I'm sure, radical groups, which means he had a lot of contact, or theoretically could have had a lot of contact, with precisely the people who would have wanted to kill him at the end of the day, and the ambassador. So I think it's going to be a very murky scene. But the only other thing I'd add is I think the Americans have a pretty good idea who was behind this attack, specifically. I don't think you have President Obama, Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, Eric Holder, the Attorney General and head of the FBI, going out on a limb and saying, we are going to bring those people to justice, unless they have a pretty good idea who they want to bring to justice.
So what are they going to do about it?
I would say they're going to work very closely with the Libyans. They'll send in FBI teams, certainly. They're also sending in anti-terrorist teams. And as we know from the record, especially when dealing with jihadists affiliated with al-Qaeda, the Obama administration has a long record of drone diplomacy.
Yeah. Well, apparently among the 4 Libyans that they've now arrested for the attack, those Libyans then gave up some names of who it turned out were senior members of the brigades in eastern Libya. So you have very clearly a picture emerging of these armed militias who've essentially been given free rein over several localities across the country, now deeply involved in what is essentially terrorist attacks.
And how many more of this sort of attack is going to have to happen until the American public has had enough? There's a cascade effect here. Right now in the United States, according to the polls I've seen overnight, this is not what's happened in Libya to Stevens, and what's happening in Egypt has had absolutely no effect on the presidential race.
Well, it sure didn't hurt Obama.
The problem is if they find them and if they hit them and kill them, they just create new martyrs. So there will be more violence, and then these people become heroes. So it's
well,
not
one of
really
the interesting things is that there are so few martyrs. It's true that a lot of walls have been climbed over and a lot of fires have been set, but not many protesters in any of these demonstrations have been shot. And it's not just because the local authorities are acquiescing. It's because, in some cases, the U.S. Embassy personnel are saying, don't shoot anybody, because it's the last thing they want.
Right, when we come back, we'll pick up on that issue of the electoral politics in the U.S. Regarding this story. Stay with us. This is The World This Week.